Hi everybody, in this video I'm going to go over the content for theme 2, which will be part of your paper 2 on Monday. And I'm going to be talking through all of the content that's included in the specification. This is the format of the exam to begin with. And don't forget to take your cup of tea into the exam. This is really important to remember throughout the exam. You need to remember T for timing, it's a mark a minute. E is to explain your points, and A is to apply, to use the data where relevant or an example of your own. So first of all, theme 2 part of this exam. Economic growth. So economic growth is an increase in GDP in an economy. An increase in real GDP is real economic growth. And you can also have a decrease in GDP, which would be negative economic growth. The difference between real and nominal are just the values for something. So the value of what's happened to GDP, maybe it's gone up from 100 million to 200 million. Whereas real figures are taking away the effect of inflation. The total output in an economy would be your GDP in total, so the output of all goods and services within a given period of time, whereas the per capita output is divided by the population, so it would be GDP divided by the population would give you GDP per capita. We are looking at the value of the goods and services which are being produced over a period of time. We're not looking at how many things have been produced. We're not counting up the number of cars, the grains of wheat, anything else that's being produced. We're looking at the value of those goods. PPP is purchasing power parity, and this is a way of looking at data but taking away the effects of the exchange rate and goods and services being different prices in different countries. It removes those distortions when you're comparing data between countries. There are limitations in looking at GDP over time because is it accurate the way that you're measuring it? Is the data that the country is providing accurate? Also, if you're not using PPP, then the exchange rate will be fluctuating, and this would affect your GDP figures if they're being expressed, for instance, in dollars, and you're converting into dollars. Likewise, the prices of goods and services changes over time, which could also distort the GDP data. National happiness is a different way of measuring the economic development of a country, and this is where you ask people for how happy they are. This is also notional happiness. You can be looking at in the country, but notional happiness, how happy do people feel? And this is done by asking them questions, but it's very subjective. It can depend on how the person is feeling on the day. But some countries now use this to measure economic development, for example, New Zealand. You may be asked to calculate or interpret an index of GDP values or other values. An index is where you are making data easier to compare by converting it into an index where all figures are being compared against the base year. The base year is made 100 in the index, and then all figures can be compared to that. To convert data into an index, you need to do the new number, the number that you're considering, divided by the old number, the base year number, times 100. And you can do this for all of the figures in a data set in order to create an index. Inflation is a sustained increase in the average price level. Deflation is a sustained decrease in the average price level. Disinflation is where you still have inflation. You can see it in the word, but it's at a lower rate. The Consumer Prices Index is calculated by, first of all, doing a survey to find out the normal average goods and services which are bought within an economy to create the basket of goods. And then people from the government go to look at the price of those goods and services in shops, and they create an index of the prices. And then they'll do the same thing again a month later to see if the price of the basket of goods has gone up or down. and this gives you the inflation rate. If the price of the basket of goods has gone up, there's been inflation. If it's gone down, there's been deflation. There are limitations in using the CPI. It doesn't include housing costs, such as interest payments on a mortgage and council tax, for example. The retail prices index does include housing costs, and therefore you could argue that it's a more accurate reflection of what's happening to the average price level in a country. There are two main causes of inflation, which are cost push and demand pull, but also the money supply changing can affect inflation. Cost push is where costs in an economy increase, and this would cause your short-run aggregate supply curve to shift to the left, and this would lead to an increase in the average price level. This is where raw material costs increase within a country, pushing up prices. Demand pull inflation, this is where your aggregate demand curve shifts to the right if there's an increase in aggregate demand and there is limited aggregate supply, then this will cause inflation. Additionally, if the money supply increases, for example, through a positive use of quantitative easing within an economy, this will mean that the value of the money circulating will decrease in value. Inflation affects consumers in positive sometimes, but mostly in negative ways. People's incomes generally are not index linked. They don't increase at the same rate as inflation. And therefore, if there is inflation, this will cause the value of people's money, what their incomes will purchase, will decrease. They won't be able to buy as much with their income. Also, if you've saved money in the bank, this would be bad for you because now the money would purchase less, so it's bad for savers. Also, it means that some people who have been working within the economy and their income stays the same, but actually they find that inflation goes up. They find that if their income does follow the inflation, they might be taken into a new tax band. So actually they have to pay more tax. There are some good things about inflation. If you're a borrower, then you will find that the money that you owe is now worth less. It will buy less. So that would be good for you as a borrower. Employment and unemployment. If you are measuring unemployment, you could do this using the claimant count. The claimant count is measuring how many people are claiming in the UK job seekers allowance, which is unemployment benefit. It's just adding up those people. Be careful, it's claimant count. Also, in the UK and in many countries in the world, we use the International Labour Organization method of measuring unemployment. In the UK, they do the UK Labour Force Survey. They ask people in the survey whether they have been unemployed for the last 4 weeks and are ready to start work in the next 2 weeks. And you will show up on the ILO measure if you are over 16 or over, whereas the claimant count in the UK, you have to be 18 to claim job seekers allowance. There are also other conditions you must meet to be able to claim job seekers allowance. For instance, you have to have been working for a period of time. You can't have significant savings. So this may well mean that the claimant count will be lower than the ILO measure. If you are unemployed, you are willing and able to work, you're seeking work, but you can't find a job. If you're underemployed, you have a job, but you would like to be using your qualifications more, or you'd like to be working longer hours. People who are economically inactive are not willing and able to work. They aren't working, and this may be because they choose not to work. It may be because they're caring for somebody. It might be because they're studying full-time. The types of unemployment, structural unemployment is where there has been a decline of a certain industry within an economy and there's no longer demand for that product. For example, the coal mining industry declined in the UK and shipbuilding as well. Frictional unemployment is where people are between jobs, they're moving from one to another for a short period of time. Seasonal unemployment is where there isn't demand for workers at a certain time of year. So, for example, if you are selling Christmas trees, in the summer you would be unemployed if you don't find another job. Demand deficient unemployment, this is where there isn't enough demand in the economy, for example, during a recession, and people don't have a job. And also it may be that the wage rate is too high, and therefore at that wage rate businesses aren't demanding as much labor. If you have cyclical unemployment, it's due to the point in the economic cycle, probably because the economy is in a slowdown or a recession. There is sometimes an inflexibility in the wages that people are receiving. For instance, if businesses aren't willing to change people's wages, and also sometimes if you have a national minimum wage in place, as we do in the UK, then wages can't fall below that. Migration will affect how many people there are in a country. Immigration increases the number of people in the country. Emigration is people exiting, people leaving. If these people moving are of working age, then it may well affect how many people there are in the workforce overall, people willing and able to work, but also people who are in employment and people who are willing and able to work but can't find a job, the unemployed. If there is significant unemployment in a country, that will have consequences. For example, the government would be paying more money on job seekers allowance or other unemployment benefits, depending on the country you're talking about. Possibly, if there's high unemployment, there may be an increase in crime. The longer people are unemployed, the harder they may find it to get back into work. They might lose skills and their mental health may suffer. If you have more people employed, then this will likely increase consumption in the economy. There will be a positive multiplier effect. Balance of payments. In theme 2, this is focused on the current account. The current account is predominantly looking at the value of exports and the value of imports. Also, a smaller component of the current account is DIP, the dividends, interest, and profits, which are coming from other elements of money which are flowing into or out of the country on the capital account. You can have a deficit on the current account, where that's where the value of exports is less than the value of imports. A surplus on the current account, the value of exports is greater than the value of imports. If there is a current account imbalance in the country, it may impact other economic objectives. For example, a current account deficit might mean that the country is not exporting enough and there isn't enough employment in sectors which are exporting. If there is a current account surplus, this may well mean that exports are significant, and this could be generating export-led growth. If a country is more connected with other countries via trade, then the current account will be more impacted, either increasing or decreasing, and have a more important role to play in the health of the economy. Aggregate demand, the formula for this is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, which is the value of exports minus the value of imports. If you are moving along the aggregate demand curve, then that means that, for instance, at a higher price level, exports will be less and therefore aggregate demand will be less. If you are shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right, AD has increased, left is less, a decrease in aggregate demand. If any of the components of aggregate demand, C, I, G, X, M, if any of those change, that will accordingly increase or decrease aggregate demand, shifting it to the right or to the left. Consumption, the first component of aggregate demand, this is how much people are spending on goods and services. This will be determined by various factors. The disposable income that people have. If people have higher income, consumption will increase. If people are saving money, then they're not spending it. So if savings go up, consumption goes down. The rate of interest, three things here. Rate of interest. The first one is how much people will decide to save. If the rate of interest is higher, they will save more and therefore spend less. Also, how much will people borrow? If the rate of interest is low, people will take more loans and they will borrow more. The money they're borrowing, they're spending, so consumption would go up. Thirdly, do people have outstanding loans? If they do, if the rate of interest goes up, if it's a variable rate loan, they'll have to spend more each month on those interest payments, and that will mean that they will have less money over for consumption, so consumption will go down. Also, consumer confidence, if this is high, if people feel secure about the future and comfortable, they're more likely to spend their money than save it, so consumption will go up. The wealth effect is about assets that people hold. For example, if they hold a house, this would mean that if you hold a house or perhaps shares, if the value of that house or the shares increases, you will feel as if you have more money. It hasn't made any difference to how much money you have, but you feel better off. And as a result of that, you will spend more. So consumption will go up. Investment, this is where firms spend money on capital, on machinery. They're adding to the economy's capital stock. Gross investment is the total investment done by firms in the country, the value of that. Net investment is gross investment, take away depreciation. So you're taking away investment which was just done to replace broken or old machines. If there is more economic growth occurring in the economy and more spending, firms are more likely to invest more because they feel that it will be worth their while to spend the money on the capital. If businesses are confident about the future, then they're much more likely to spend money on machinery and to invest because they feel that it will get used. And also, if they've borrowed money to buy the capital, they'll be making enough revenue to be able to repay that loan. Keynes, the economist, he talked about animal spirits. This is about how businesses are feeling and their feelings and confidence impacting how much they will invest. If a business is exporting and there's an increase in the demand for exports, then firms are much more likely to invest in capital. Just like with consumers and consumption, for investment, if the rate of interest is low, firms are more likely to borrow because borrowing is cheaper. They have to pay back less interest, so they're much more likely to borrow and spend the money on investment. If rates of interest are high, firms are much more likely to want to save their profits rather than spending them on investment, so investment would decrease. And thirdly, if a firm has an outstanding loan and it's on a variable rate, if the rate of interest goes up, they'll have to pay more interest per month, and this will mean that they'll have less money left over to spend on investment, so investment will go down. Additionally, does a firm have access to credit? Can they borrow money? In a recession, for example, banks may be very reluctant to lend. They're worried that it will be a high risk that the money won't be repaid. Credit would be difficult to get, and the firm would be less likely to invest as a result because they don't have enough money without borrowing. The government can do things to influence how much investment occurs. They could subsidize investment, for example, for businesses. They could change regulations to make it more difficult or easier for firms to invest. Government spending or government expenditure. This is how much the government spends at local government and national government. And this will be affected by the economic cycle, partly and largely because of automatic stabilizers. This means that in a recession, for example, more people are unemployed. Automatically, the government will be spending more money on unemployment benefits, which will increase government expenditure. But also fiscal policy in general will affect government spending. How much do they choose to spend at any time? And remember that you need to think of how much the government spend and how much they receive in tax revenue as separate things. Sometimes the government will be receiving more tax revenue, for example, in a boom, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they will spend that money at that point. Net trade is the final part of aggregate demand. This is the value of exports minus the value of imports. This will be determined by the real income of people within your country and in your trading partner countries. If incomes in the UK increase, people will have more money, they're more likely to go shopping, they're more likely to buy imported goods. So the value of imports is likely to go up. If the exchange rate changes, this will affect how much an economy imports or exports. The acronym to remember here is SPICED, strong pound, imports cheap, exports dear. Also, the state of the world economy. If your trading partners are doing well, they're in a boom, then their incomes will be going up. They're more likely to demand your exports, so your country is more likely to export more. Protectionism is barriers to trade. If your country puts protectionism in place, for example, tariffs on imports, quotas on imports, this will mean there are less imports. The value of imports will go down. Equally, if your trading partners put protectionism in place on your products, then when you export to that country, tariffs, quotas will be placed on your exports and you will export less. The value of exports will go down. Other things that affect exports and imports is the quality of those things being exported or imported. That will affect the demand for them. Perhaps also the innovation of products, whether they are new and modern and perhaps including technology. That might increase demand for them. If you're exporting products like that, you may well see an increase in the value of your exports. Aggregate supply, this is the total productive potential of an economy. It's equivalent to a production possibility frontier. The aggregate supply curve can be Keynesian, which is where it's perfectly elastic and becomes perfectly inelastic. It can also be a classical aggregate supply curve, which is perfectly inelastic throughout. A classical LRAS curve, perfectly inelastic, this assumes that the economy is working at full productive potential at all times and that the market clears. There aren't unemployed resources in the long run. If you move along an aggregate supply curve, in the case of a Keynesian long-run aggregate supply curve, if you are increasing output, then you are using more factors of production. The more factors of production that you use, they're becoming more scarce, so their price starts to increase. And that's why as you increase the output in the economy, the real output, eventually the price level will start to increase as the LRAS curve becomes more inelastic. You also have short-run aggregate supply curves, and these will show movement if something changes in the short run, whereas long run is the long run aggregate supply curve, and this is where all factors are variable. Short-run aggregate supply will shift if you have changes in these three factors. These are short-run changes, sometimes called supply-side shocks. If the cost of raw materials increases, for example, SRAS will shift to the left. It would cause an increase in the average price level. If the currency gets weaker, this will mean that your economy will be able to afford less imports. This will decrease how much they're capable of producing. The SRAS curve would shift to the left. If the tax rates for businesses increase in the short term, this will mean firms are capable of producing less. The SRAS would shift to the left. Long-run aggregate supply, as I said before, can be Keynesian. This is where it's perfectly elastic becoming perfectly inelastic, or it can be classical, which is perfectly inelastic throughout. There are many things which will increase an economy's productive potential or decrease if they decrease. If productive potential increases, LRAS will shift to the right. If it decreases, it will shift to the left. Technological advance increasing will shift it to the right. Relative productivity, so against your competitors, if the productivity increases, your economy is capable of producing more, LRAS shifts to the right. If the skills and education of your workforce increase, productive potential increases, it shifts LRAS to the right. If government regulations become more relaxed or regulations are removed, firms will be capable of producing more and LRAS will shift to the right. If you have an increase in the size of the workforce, for example, there are now more people of working age due to demographics or migration into the country, immigration, this would increase productive potential and long-run aggregate supply. If the government uses competition policy to encourage there being more competition and more firms, this will increase efficiency of firms as they try to compete with each other, and this would overall in the economy increase productive potential and shift LRAS to the right. National income, this can be illustrated in the circular flow of income, which is the flow of money between households and firms. The money flows round the circular flow, and the income is equal to expenditure, which is equal to output. And you can look at income within an economy, which is a flow concept. This is money people are receiving on a regular basis, for example, their wage or salary or benefits or a pension. Wealth is the assets that people hold, for example, a house or shares in a company, and this is a stock concept. Within the circular flow of income, you can have injections and withdrawals. There are 3 injections. Those are government spending, investment by firms, and exports. When we export products, money comes into the economy. That's an injection. There are 3 withdrawals that can happen from the circular flow. That is where taxation occurs, money leaks out or is withdrawn. If people save money, that's a withdrawal. And if people import products, then money leaves the circular flow because money goes to another country. The equilibrium level of real national output occurs where long-run aggregate supply is equal to aggregate demand. If either LRAS or AD move, this will affect and change the equilibrium level of real national output. The multiplier, this is a number that you can calculate. If you have an injection into the economy, the multiplier will multiply that by a certain number. For example, the multiplier may be 2, and this will mean that the final impact on the economy is the injection multiplied, in that case, by 2. So the final impact on the money in the circular flow will be bigger than the initial injection. The multiplier can be positive or negative if there's a withdrawal. The multiplier process is about the idea that if there's an injection, the money becomes somebody's income, but then they go on to spend that money and it becomes another person's income and then another person's income. As the money passes from person to person, it multiplies within the economy. However, if there are any leakages from that person, from taxation, saving, or imports, then that reduces the size of the multiplier. The MPC is the marginal propensity to consume. That's out of an additional amount of income, what proportion is spent on consumption. MPS, marginal propensity to save. Out of an additional amount of income, what proportion is used for saving. Marginal propensity to tax. Out of an additional proportion of income, what proportion will be paid in tax. The calculation of the multiplier, 1 divided by the marginal propensity to withdraw. Remember that the 3 withdrawals are savings, tax, and imports. So to get the marginal propensity to withdraw, you add together MPS, MPT, and MPM, marginal propensity to import. If you add together the marginal propensity to withdraw and the marginal propensity to consume, you get 1. Therefore, it's also true that the multiplier is 1 divided by 1 minus MPC. If you wanted to show the impact of the multiplier on an ADAS diagram, if you have an injection, for instance, investment, and AD increases, ceteris paribus, it shifts to the right, the multiplier effect would cause there to be another slight shift to the right. Causes of growth within an economy. There are many things which could cause economic growth, it could be because you have an increase in actual output, which is actual or real economic growth. For instance, if AD increases and shifts to the right. You could also have potential economic growth. This is where the productive potential of the economy has increased. On a diagram, that would be where long-run aggregate supply shifts to the right. With potential economic growth, you don't have to have an increase in output. It's just that the potential has increased. Whereas with actual economic growth, there is an increase in real output. It's possible that a change, for instance, an increase in LRAS, will result in actual or real economic growth, so an increase in real output, but it will also result in potential economic growth. If an economy exports more and this increases their aggregate demand, this would be export-led growth. Output gaps, there are two different ways of looking at this. You could be looking at the difference between the growth in the economy compared to the long-term trend. If your growth is higher than the long-term trend, that would be a positive output gap. If your growth is less than the long-term trend, that would be a negative output gap. You can also look at output gaps on an ADAS diagram. If your equilibrium level of output is less than your highest possible level of output, your economy's productive potential, then you have a negative output gap. If your output for a short period of time is higher than your maximum potential output in your economy, then this would mean that you've got a positive output gap. That would be an extreme situation where perhaps everybody in the economy is working at full capacity and overtime for a 24-hour period. The trade or business or economic cycle, they each mean the same thing. This is where you go through in an economy from a boom to a slowdown to a recession, then a recovery, then a boom, and on. It goes up and down, up and down. If an economy is in a boom, there will be high employment, people's incomes will be higher, consumption will be higher, there'll be more investment. In a recession, which is 2 or more consecutive quarters of negative economic growth, you will see an increase in unemployment, consumption will fall, people will be investing less if they own a business. Economic growth can have advantages and disadvantages. Advantages are that as output increases, generally people will have more likelihood of having a job, employment will go up. This will mean that incomes will increase as more people are earning an income. People's standard of living will increase. Also, some people may be lifted out of poverty if they now have a job or if they're earning more. And it will also mean for businesses that they're making higher profits. Disadvantages of economic growth are it may lead to more inequality because the owners of the businesses may make more money out of the economic growth than the workers. Also, some people may see more of an increase in their salaries or wages than other people. Additionally, the economic growth can lead to more damage to the environment. If the economic growth is being generated by the output of manufactured goods, but also if people have higher incomes, they're more likely to use fossil fuels, and this will damage the environment. Also, if people are importing more goods because they have higher incomes, these goods have to be transported, which also generates pollution into the environment. Different economic agents will be affected differently by the economic growth. Remember, you're looking at consumers and producers and the government, and the environment potentially as a fourth economic agent. If your economic growth is fueled by an increase in investment in an economy, this won't necessarily help people's living standards now, because more capital won't improve people's lives. However, in the long run, if an economy has more capital, they're capable of producing more, which can actually improve people's standard of living in the future. The macroeconomic objectives within an economy, in the UK we have 7 main ones: to have positive and stable economic growth, to have low or no unemployment, To have low and stable inflation, we have a target range of 2% plus or minus 1%. To have an equilibrium on the current account of the balance of payments so that the value of exports is equal to the value of imports. To have a balanced government budget so that government spending is equal to tax revenue. For the environment to be protected so that we have sustainable economic development and economic growth, and also to have greater income equality. The government can intervene into the economy to try and achieve the macroeconomic objectives. Firstly, they can use demand-side policies. This is using policies to impact aggregate demand. These can be expansionary if you aim to increase aggregate demand, or contractionary if you aim to decrease aggregate demand. Monetary policy is where the rate of interest and quantitative easing are used to impact the economy. The rate of interest could go down, for example, to encourage consumption and investment, increasing aggregate demand. Quantitative easing is where the money supply is increased, and this aims to increase consumption and investment, which is an expansionary monetary policy. Fiscal policy is to do with government spending and taxation. If this is expansionary, government spending would go up, taxation would decrease in order to increase consumption and investment. When using fiscal policy, the government might end up having a budget deficit, for example, if they're increasing government spending and decreasing taxation. It may result in a budget surplus. The government with fiscal policy can apply direct taxes or indirect taxes. A direct tax is a tax on income or profits. An indirect tax is a tax on goods and services. If you have an expansionary demand-side policy, AD will shift to the right. Contractionary demand-side policy, AD will shift to the left. You will get a new macroeconomic equilibrium with a new level of real output and a new price level. But this will depend on where you started your equilibrium. If you're on the perfectly elastic or perfectly inelastic part of your LRAS curve, you may not see a change in either the price level or the real output. The Bank of England and the Monetary Policy Committee, they are independent of the government. The Monetary Policy Committee is part of the Bank of England. They set interest rates. They meet monthly to do this. And it is the Bank of England that can also implement quantitative easing. The demand-side policies used in the Great Depression in the 1920s and in the 2008 crisis, the financial crisis, in the US and the UK were slightly different. In the Great Depression, the US recovered more quickly than the UK. In the UK, we didn't use expansionary fiscal policies quickly. And we also were within the gold standard, so we were using some contractionary monetary policy, which didn't help us. In America, they started using expansionary fiscal policy, spending on things like the Hoover Dam, and this helped to get them out of the Depression. In the 2008 financial crisis, the UK had learnt some lessons from their response to the Great Depression, and the UK and the US both used expansionary fiscal policy. They both decreased interest rates, which was expansionary monetary policy. They also spent money bailing out banks, whereas in the Great Depression, some of those banks had been left to fail. Demand-side policies can vary in their effectiveness. With monetary policy, do consumers and businesses respond to changes in interest rates? It depends a lot on confidence of consumers and businesses. Also, do banks want to give loans when there are low rates of interest if they're worried about whether they will be repaid? If the rate of interest is too low, you can't lower it any further. You may need to use quantitative easing. With fiscal policy, if, for example, it's expansionary, it can lead to a budget deficit and contribute to national debt. And is that something that your economy wants? Supply-side policies are where the government intervenes to influence the long-run aggregate supply in the economy, either increasing LRAS or they could be looking at not increasing it too much. But the point of the supply side policy is to increase your productive potential. These can be market-based. This is where the government takes a step away. They are not getting involved. They're allowing the market to function more freely. This would be things like privatizing industries, removing regulations, promoting competition. Interventionist is where the government gets involved. They spend money, for example, on infrastructure, education, or health. Also, market-based, the government could increase incentives for people to work and increase the workforce. For example, if they put down income tax rates, some people might now choose to work. They might stop being economically inactive because they get to keep more of their income. The government can promote competition by encouraging smaller firms, giving them subsidies, for example, and lowering regulations to make it easier to enter an industry. Reform of the labour market, this could be reducing trade union power so that firms' costs decrease and they're capable of producing more, shifting LRAS to the right. They could also make it easier for firms to make people redundant quickly, which would reduce costs for firms. The government can spend money increasing skills and the quality of the labour force through education and training. They can improve infrastructure by building better roads, ports, airports, improving broadband. This is another interventionist approach. If supply-side policies are effective, they will increase the LRAS curve to the right. Supply-side policies can have a large time lag, and it depends on the quality of what's provided, of how effective they are. When you are using economic policies, you can find that there are conflicts between them. One of them might be achieved, but other ones aren't achieved. For example, the short-run Phillips curve, this talks about the relationship between inflation and unemployment, saying that if inflation is decreased, this may lead to an increase in unemployment. So when policy is being set, government needs to try and consider the trade-offs, that they might fulfill one macroeconomic objective but fail on one other or others, plural. So paper 2, some things for you to remember when you go in and you're looking at longer answer questions and essays, these ones here. And really good luck on Monday. I hope it goes well. There will be another video after this, which is summarising the theory in theme 4, which is the final thing that you'll need for the exam.